Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's session, Manage Cyber Risk with Confidence. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now I would like to introduce today's presenter from Moss Adams, Ryan Stewart. His bio and contact information are located in your webcast console if you would like more information. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Ryan to get the presentation started.
All right, thank you, Danielle, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at. I'm Ryan Stewart. I'm a Cybersecurity Consulting Manager here at Moss Adams, and today I'd like to introduce you to managing cyber risk and hopefully build that confidence within your organization on how you address risk and manage risk. And I guess first I'll start off with somewhat of a little story. I was talking to a colleague last week, and I was asked, what is your pet peeve regarding risk assessments? And I said, interesting thing is, next week I'm doing a webcast about that, but one of my pet peeves is taking risk identified through risk assessments beyond what we see out there in the industry a lot is the high, medium, and low designation for risk. And so what I'm hoping to help you all with today is to give you some tools, techniques, and ideas to ask some questions to those within your organization who are telling you that you have a high risk and they need money to address it, to help reduce it, whatever the case is, and just get those conversations going on really digging deeper into risk assessments and risk in general. So hopefully today, we'll be able to get you some good knowledge on this agenda regarding cyber risk management definition, identifying some cyber risk, the role of the risk owner, risk scenario development, key risk indicators, and risk registers. Hopefully you've heard a lot of these terms before, but if you haven't, you'll get a good overview today. And feel free to drop questions in the Q&A if you have any specific questions about these, and do our best to get those addressed. So by the end of this course, we hope that you can define cyber risk management, identify risk owners within your organization, be able to develop risk scenarios, maybe not in the level of detail that you're going to see today, but at least get the concept going in your organization. Discuss practical methods and methodological, I can't speak today, approach to developing risk scenarios, and discuss practical approaches to developing key risk indicators. So on the left, you'll see just a basic cyber risk definition. Cyber attack to your organization that disrupts your business, has the potential to disrupt the business is, a cyber risk. And don't just think of it as, anything out there in cyberspace, what we see digital, but you can have attacks from the environment that can affect your technologies, and those are also cyber risks to consider. And here, are some examples. We have 290 attendees, so I apologize if you're with any of these organizations. Wasn't meant to call anybody out specifically, but as you read through these, I hope that you'll see the theme here is data. Data theft, data compromise, data breach, data exfiltration, all of these things. So I'm hoping that, when we're talking about cybersecurity in general, that data is, one of those crown jewels that's being discussed, if not the crown jewel within your organization. So most attacks that happen these days do affect data. Brought out or addressed Twitter here for zero-day vulnerabilities, and that we'll talk about vulnerability assessments a little later. But zero-day vulnerabilities can cause data breaches when threat actors are aware of those or become aware of those zero-day vulnerabilities, which don't have a fix to them yet. And so just one of those things to consider when you're talking about risk in the organization. So we'll jump into our first polling question here.
So polling question number 1, how often do executive leaders or board members receive updates on the IT risk posture in your organization? A, at least once per month, B, at least once per quarter, C, at least once per year, D, we don't have any regular updates right now, E, I don't know. I'll give you a few moments to respond. To respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. If you can't see the button, please enlarge the slide area. Looks like most of you have submitted your responses. I will go ahead and forward to the results.
All right, well, that's good to see that at least once per quarter, almost a quarter of you are receiving updates on the IT risk posture. 29 don't know, that's all right. Not everybody is in those executive positions, but it's good to know that those conversations are taking place. If you don't have regular updates right now, this could be something to put on one of your next committee agendas to discuss on how you can get visibility on risk going forward. Okay, so let's just go into some ways to identify cyber risk. And so generally, risk assessment is the number one way to identify risk. But there's factors that go into that. So you have your threat assessment, which you're going to want to identify the threats to your organization, services, assets, individuals, to get an idea about what threats you're facing, and to kind of put that into real life or basic example is, your road trip. What's the threat on a road trip if you're going somewhere? You could have potholes in the road, which could cause issues to your vehicle, whatever the case is. And then that's kind of where you go into your vulnerabilities. If you have a weakness in an information system, just to compare a weakness in your vehicle, maybe bad tires or something like that. But you definitely want to look at your threats and make sure that you're also comparing those against your vulnerability assessment, weakness in your system. So business impact analysis, we've all heard of these. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't do business impact analysis. And if they do it, it's kind of like a light business impact analysis. But you definitely want to use the business impact analysis to go into detail, and you can identify risk through this exercise as well. So loss of technology asset is a cyber threat. And so when you go through the business impact analysis exercise, there's such a focus on technology that you really get an idea of how services in your organization and data are going to be affected. And that plays into other areas of your cybersecurity program, such as your business continuity and disaster recovery programs. So there's a couple of different approaches here that you can take if you don't have time to do an entire risk assessment, but you just want to get an idea about what's going on in the world, do a threat assessment. If you want to know how weak your systems are, a vulnerability assessment. If you want to gauge how your cybersecurity program is doing, then that's where your gap assessment comes in place. And that's where, you compare it to an industry framework, or, if you have a well-defined set of security controls internal to your organization, then you do a gap assessment against your internal controls. So as I mentioned, the risk assessment is somewhat of a combination between the threat and vulnerability assessment. That you can also monitor those security groups to get vulnerabilities. And InfoGuard's a big one, CISA, DHS, ISACA, all of these organizations you can subscribe to get information about the threats that are out there to help you determine what risks are to your organization. Executive priorities. So as organizations develop their strategic plans or update them, introduce new components to the business, they definitely are considering risks there. The component that is sometimes overlooked is cyber risk to the business. So anytime there's a merger and acquisition and somebody's taking on risk from another organization, you're introducing those into the parent organization, and so you have to consider those risks to the business as well. And then obviously personal experience. We all have different personal experiences out there, and so that's where leaders are relied on to bring that to the table and say, we did this in the past, maybe this didn't work. It didn't work at our organization, so let's consider that because it could create risk here. All right, so we're going to move on to the next polling question.
Thank you, Ryan. For poll number 2, what cyber threats keep you up at night? Ransomware, B, hackers breaking into my network to steal sensitive information, C, accidental breaches or leaks by authorized users, D, scammers posing as my employees to target our customers, E, all of the above. As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. Well, leave this up for a few more moments as some of you continue to respond. And Ryan, here are our results.
All right, thank you, Danielle. Ransomware, top of the list. That was expected to be there. I think everybody has heard about so much ransomware. We all know what it is. And so, you know, if these are keeping you up at night, I guess if we were having a conversation, I'd be asking, what are you doing to reduce the risk of ransomware in your organization? All of the above, yeah. I mean, there's so many risks out there, and so again, previous slides that talked about to what degree. And so I'm hoping, you know, as we get into the next content, you're able to start to be able to determine, are you really at a high risk for a certain risk that's been identified in your risk assessment, or is it something you have compensating controls for, whatever the case is? It looks like we do have a question. I'll go ahead and address it since we just talked about, does the strategic plan create the risk or identify the risk? And if it does create the risk, how? Okay, so I wouldn't necessarily say that it identifies the risk. I think the strategic plan, when we're talking about like a business strategic plan, those are plans that, you know, organizations are implementing to help grow, to change strategy, to become more successful, whatever the case is. And so I think, you know, it can help identify risks because there's risk from competition, but it can also create risks because, you know, you have to take risks to a certain degree. And so it's just saying that what I'm saying is that if you're implementing a strategic plan to improve your business, to consider the risks of that and just also ensure that you're considering cyber risk. Okay, so risk ownership. I think we've all heard that, you know, security is an organizational responsibility. And when it comes to risk, I think, you know, my perspective is that risk is also an organizational responsibility. And typically a cyber security risk assessment or an IT risk assessment, and you come back with this comprehensive list of all these controls that have been put in place, weaknesses in those controls, if any. If there are weaknesses, then what the risks are. And so once the leader of the IT department or the CISO gets that report, you know, they typically want to begin, you know, remediating this risk. And so, but not all risks, just because they were associated to IT, are IT's responsibility. And so, you know, it's important here to identify risk owners outside of just the IT department, because there are certain functions such as HR, for example, as I put here, that could have risk ownership when it comes to certain technology aspects. And another example not on the screen is the onboarding process, and making sure that background screens are done appropriately and that people going into sensitive positions are screened appropriately. But the point is that when risks are identified from a risk assessment and you're getting into that remediation stage, that you're assigning the risk out appropriately and not just putting the burden on the cybersecurity department to try to fix everything, or the IT department. So it needs to be looked at holistically as an organizational responsibility. All right, so this next portion is kind of the meat of this presentation. The previous slides were an overview. I think that I saw that there were a lot of executives on this call, CFOs, people in auditing. so you probably have a good idea about that. But the risk scenario, it's a narrative about a particular risk to the business. And I want to emphasize that to the business. It's not just to the IT department. Helps leaders gain a realistic and practical view of risk and how the risk owner is managing the risk. So this content, this is, it's very detailed, and what I'm hoping for is, I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'd like for you to skim through these and maybe hone in on some areas where you do well. If you're developing risk scenarios, and if you're not, then hey, you can take a screen capture, whatever, to get an idea of how you could use this in your organization. But the purpose of the risk scenario development is really kind of like a tabletop exercise. I think a lot of organizations have been through it, where you're saying, hey, here's a situation we could be in, and how are we going to address this situation, this incident, should it come to fruition? And it's kind of the same way with a risk scenario. So when you identify a risk from a risk assessment, that's a great start, and you can begin completing a risk scenario with that information. But this is where, like I mentioned at the beginning, taking it beyond just the high, medium, and low, and kind of challenging what is the substance behind the risk. So, as a leader, if somebody comes to me with an assessment and says, hey, we have a high risk due to an access control. Okay, why is it a high risk? Who made that determination? Is it just because our passwords aren't up to the length that this organization or the standard says they should be? And I could say, yeah, that's it. Well, what if we have multi-factor authentication in place? What if we have other compensating controls in place? Is it still a high risk? And so that's kind of where the risk scenario development comes into play. And so for the risk scenario title, you just want to give a brief description of what it is. There's an example there: data stored in a third-party hosted solution gets compromised. Okay, and so then the risk type, and here are some examples of definitions that you can include, and how your organization could be affected. And there could be multiple types. It could have an effect on service quality and product quality, or data and system protections. And then when you want to categorize the risk scenario, so when you're talking about your categories, you definitely want to kind of nail it down to, is it information technology, an ability to support and maintain certain technology, whatever the case is? Is it data compromise? So that's where you want to fill in that information about the risk type, and it identifies the business function impacted. And so I do want to tie this section back to that business impact analysis, which is why I said you can use business impact analysis to identify risk. And then a risk statement, multi-factor authentication is a configured to access donor statement. So that's kind of like what your risk is. And then next, you want to assign your risk owner, risk oversight. So, that risk owner could be an HR, but it could be the CISO who has oversight of that, since it's a cyber risk. Or it could be the board the IT steering committee, security steering committee, who's tracking key risk indicators and monitoring and things like that. Sorry, just want to pause for a second. I see a question. That was a question, more of a comment. Okay, so moving on. So attributes. So as I mentioned earlier about the threat assessments. So now that you've if you've done your threat assessment, identified threat actors, this is where you can use that information to put into your risk scenario and identify, why you feel that this threat actor and who they are could affect your business. What is their intent and motivation? So I do want to address in the intent and motivation, because the statement here, it's not to seem negative, but it says the threat actor is a company, and generally the threat actor is a company insider and the event is accidental. So just want to consider, and this is something we say in security a lot, is biggest threat to your organization is the insider threat. And it's not that people are out there trying to do malicious things. It's just people make mistakes. We're all human. And so we do have to recognize that. So if ransomware, being that number one thing that keeps people up at night, is an issue, the company insider, the person clicking on a malicious email that could launch an attack against your organization, maybe it was an accidental click on a link or something like that. And so you just have to take that into consideration. But there are other motivations out there, whether or not to destroy people's reputation, and that could just be the entire organization, or it could be a leader in the organization. Threat event, so when and where the threat actor acts against the asset. So just take into consideration that, as I mentioned, it's not just digital or threat actors out there in cyberspace. You do have environmental threats that can occur, and so if you're in an area where there's a lot of hurricanes that could bring down your systems, that would be something that you would want to document in your risk scenario. And then the assets under consideration. Typically, this is data, but it can be tangible and intangible. Data, services, if you're in a city and you have SCADA systems and those things have to run, and those systems get attacked, that could be something that is more tangible, where you have kind of a manufacturing type environment. So consequences, the effect or result of adverse outcomes, basically what's going to happen. Are we going to lose millions of dollars? Are we going to lose millions of rows of data? Is our reputation going to be affected? So these are definitely things that you want to identify here. And going back to that business impact analysis, this is information that you can gain from a business impact analysis. Same with the impact, predictivity, cost of response, replacement, things from that business impact analysis that would be beneficial. And so I do want to pause here for a moment, because, while this is structured to, be put into eventually a risk register, as you'll see, I think that it's important that when we're looking at these, that these are things that can go through your head as to ask questions to those who are, if you're a CFO and somebody's asking for a large amount of money because they have a high risk, that you can begin to ask these questions, or, who's going to manage this risk if you feel that that's warranted. Did you really dig into the threats against the organization? Basically provide some substance behind why you think it's a high risk and why you think we need to expend this money. Timing, I think timing is something that is critical here, because any critical time period in which a loss event would be especially harmful. I think the weekends are probably a time period where, we don't want to have all of our people out of office get attacked and people have gone for a long weekend, such as Memorial Day weekend. We typically hear about an increase in attacks against organizations when long weekends are rolling around. And I'm sure that with a simple Google search, there would be a laundry list that comes up that have happened last Memorial Day weekend. All right, so worst case scenario, this could be total disaster. What's the worst case of a hurricane destroying our data center and we don't have a backup data center? Now all operations have ceased. We can't provide our services, whatever the case is. You just definitely want to bring that to light, because even though it may not happen, it always has the potential to happen, but it may not always be probable. Extent of the risk scenario, what is their intent and motivation behind getting into your organization and getting data? Money is typically what ransomware goes after, but also reputation, because as soon as somebody falls victim to ransomware, if you are a healthcare organization, you could end up on a list where you've been attacked, and that information is out there for the public to see. I understand, there's a lot of not-for-profits on here, but if you are for-profit, that could affect your stock price. Best case scenarios. What's the best case for when a threat actor acts against asset? Never. But at least if during the week is better than on the weekend, and having your staff available to respond to an incident or an attack is the best case. And then any assumptions. Value that is under consideration of the risk scenario. Assets can be intangible, so there could be one or more assets. So just make sure that you're describing any assumptions there that you have regarding the risk scenario. So I know that's a lot of information, and I do want to pause. Are there any questions that anybody wants to put into the QA regarding the risk scenario portion? Okay, so as we continue, this is the really important areas. So within those risk assessments, there's typically a documentation of, what is your inherent risk, and then your residual risk. And so when you're able to get that information and put it into this risk scenario, you're able to really nail down what your controls are that you have in place. And so we've painted a picture of what the risk is, when it could happen, but what are you doing about that right now? So, and that's where your controls are important to be identified here. And so you can have multiple controls within that are addressing your risk scenario. So you definitely want to consider all of those, preventative, detective, and corrective controls. The effect on impact, the estimated effect that this control has on the impact. So does it indicate here a qualitative indicator? So the risk assessments, if they're subjective, don't typically go into they're quantitative. So I'm sorry, they're qualitative, but the goal is to be able to get to a quantitative approach at some point, where you're identifying dollar values. And so while it may be expressed as qualitative, if you're able to identify value from the effect of a risk, it definitely has it gets more visibility when money is involved. So just take that into consideration. So effect on frequency. all of these things here, this impact, as it's talking about impact, that goes back to your business impact analysis and the sections that were addressed previously in the risk scenario. But this all relates to how your controls are managing that risk. And so this is definitely a section where if you don't have a gap assessment and you haven't identified all your controls, it can make it difficult to really complete this section of the risk scenario. All right, so there's a section for risk scenario development regarding key risk indicators. And so the KRIs, that's where we start to get into kind of the numbers. And so you want to be able to develop a list of key risk indicators that are going to help you as an organization determine when risk is fluctuating. And so, as it says here, as a measurable element, percentages are typically what we would want to see. If it's service-related, percentage of service targets being met. I see that the sound went out. Danielle, are you still able to hear me?
Yeah, go ahead and continue.
Okay. Let's see here. Who will be responsible for providing KRI information? So, when we're talking about things such as incidents or training or capacity, those subject matter experts, those managers that are managing those certain technologies or services or teams that can gather that information is where it would come from. So if you're talking about reducing the number of incidents within your organization, your security analyst, your SOC team may have that information. If you're trying to determine, how often you are falling victim to phishing attacks, that's where your security team is going to want to help you out if they're doing phishing campaigns. So you can run those campaigns and get percentages back from that to gauge where you are at regarding your security awareness and training. So, but the data just depends on the scenario and where you'd want to collect it from. Here we have, actual lag and lead indicators, actual occurrence of risk, potential increase in likelihood of risk. So, again, if you are having a certain number of incidents a day and you feel like, this is going to increase because controls or the threats out there are increasing, then you could predict that you may have some more security incidents in the future. So it's just something to consider there regarding your KRIs. So the overall point of the KRI is similar to a key performance indicator, is to be able to identify whether or not your risk is increasing or decreasing, and to be able to monitor that. And that's part of your overall risk management program. Okay, so we're going to break for a quick polling question.
All right, poll question number 3. Does your organization have a risk register that identifies cyber risks? A, yes. B, no. C, I don't know. You do have the option to submit questions for us by using the Q&A window. We have quite a bit of content to cover today, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. And it looks like we're getting pretty close here. I'll give everybody a few more seconds to respond to our polling question. And Ryan, here are the results.
All right, 35% yes, so I think that's good. I hope in the next slide, your risk register reflects something, what I'm going to show you. And again, a lot of that information from the risk scenario development can go into your risk register. And this is, you may have an automated solution, some GRC tool out there that does this for you, and that's great. I feel like with those tools, the information is only good as the information put into it. So, make sure you are checking those tools so that they reflect the correct and accurate information. But basically, a risk register is your repository of all the risk. And this is one of those tools where, you manage it, maybe not day to day, hopefully you do, but somebody is looking at it to identify, as threats out there are being discovered, as vulnerabilities are being discovered. You're going into your risk register, seeing if you have the right controls in place, who you're going to contact to help address that risk by contacting the risk owner. Do you need to add to your controls? Did you have an increase in incidents that are causing the probability of it to of the occurrence to increase? All of those factors should be in your risk register. So key risk indicators, again, metrics used by the organization. The key things with the key risk indicator is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. If you are not able to attain those goals, it's really difficult to kind of justify the information in there. So you just want to be realistic about what you're doing. Not every organization can put into, have the best technology stack, have every control that's out there, which is why we have compensating controls, but it's the best effort. Managing risk is difficult, especially when it comes to technology. So just take that into consideration, that you're being that your goals are attainable. Relevant, if you create a risk register and it becomes outdated, it may no longer be relevant, which is why we encourage you to do the ongoing risk management and to update your risk register to ensure that it stays relevant to your organization. So just some examples of KRIs is a lack of a succession plan for key roles. So talent acquisition is a challenge for a lot of organizations, and so with turnover, if you have a key role that leaves, and that person is the only one that has all the information, that could be a high risk for your organization. Incidents, if you're having a lot of incidents involving customer data, that would be something that should be a key risk indicator. Incidents involving personal data, maybe employees aren't trained appropriately, so maybe they're disclosing data that they shouldn't be. So again, these are just examples. This information about key risk indicators, and the risk register is available through organizations like ISACA, ISO, a lot of sources for this information. Again, the purpose of one of the main purposes of this is to give you ideas and help you ask the right questions within your organization to challenge those risk assessments that you get that just leave it at high, medium, and low, and to really be able to dig deeper and identify what is truly a risk within the organization. It looks like we are moving into next poll question.
All right, here's our fourth and final poll question. How would your organization benefit most from an IT risk assessment? A, evaluate the strength of existing security measures. B, identify and mitigate threats and vulnerabilities. C, serve as the basis for defining a security strategy and better justify security investments. D, all of the above. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. We will also be sending the slides via email tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast. I'll allow a few more seconds for everybody to respond. Fantastic. And if you're having any issues seeing the polling question, please make sure that your slide view is open using the icons below. And Ryan, here are the results.
All right, awesome. All of the above. All right, so just some takeaways from this. I hope everybody sees the benefit of the risk scenario development process and key risk indicators. But takeaways, cyber risk can be identified through many approaches. So you don't have to always just do the risk assessment. There are other things that you can do, business impact assessments. Probably something I highly recommend all organizations do, business impact analysis. So if you haven't done one of those, I highly encourage you to do those. Risk scenarios can help organizations identify possible risk events and document those factors. So again, this is where you're diving deeper and asking those tougher questions about why a risk is rated a certain level. You may find that low risks are high risk and vice versa. So just it's important to ask those questions and go through that exercise. Having a risk register help you can not only consolidate your information but manage your risk, and it helps to show that you have a more mature risk program. So if you're gauging maturity in your organization, like COVID maturity model or something of that nature, having a risk register certainly helps to improve your maturity. Key risk indicators, it's your ability to measure risk levels, to track if they're going up and down, but it determines if it exceeds your organization's risk tolerance. And so your organization can only take on so much risk, and so you have to be cognizant of that and ensure that you are monitoring it. All right.
Okay, it looks like we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So Ryan, one of the questions that came through, who typically manages the risk register?
So that's a great question. When we're talking about cyber risk, it's typically somebody in the GRC, on the GRC team of the cybersecurity team, if you have that person available. But really, it's who you designate within your organization that you feel has the experience to, help identify risk, manage risk, and, track risk.
Great. Another question that came through, do you have any comments about the nature and types of insurance to cover cybersecurity risks? Any considerations?
There are, there is cyber insurance out there. And so the types of coverage, I'm not an insurance specialist. I do, just based off of experience, I think it's important that your cyber insurance policy offers some kind of, incident response to help you out if you don't have, a large cybersecurity team that will help you identify, if you did actually have a breach because of the regulations out there. You may have an incident, but it doesn't always result in a breach. So I think it's good to have a cyber insurance team that can help you out with those and provide that type of service.
Great. Another one that came through, how does a gap assessment identify cyber risk?
So that's also a great question. So that gap assessment, if you think back to that slide, was really against a standardized framework. But those controls that are within those frameworks are popular across all organizations. They're kind of like the baseline set of controls that every organization should have. So let's just, asset management is typically in every standardized framework out there. And if you don't have asset management, sound asset management in place, then you don't know how to protect your assets. So you have to know what you have in order to protect it. And so if that gap assessment identifies that your asset management controls are below what the baseline is, then the chances are you're going to have there's always risk that you're going to have increased risk in your asset management area, but not just asset management across your entire IT department. Because if you don't know what you have, then you can't protect it.
Great. A lot of really fantastic questions coming through here.
Yeah, I see one that says, I work at a school. What's the best overall control you could recommend to nonprofits with very limited staff and budgets? The best overall control. That's pretty broad. I don't think that there's just one control, but I think if you're at a small organization, that security awareness and training is probably going to have a high impact. Because I personally, I have kids in school, and I've been given password or login information to look at grades and things like that, and they send me a password that I can't reset, and it just makes me think, are the schools practicing best practice cybersecurity? And so likely budgets are smaller. Maybe they don't have the money to implement that type of technology, but it could be something as simple as a configuration. So whoever's in charge of that particular application, maybe they just need to get trained on it a little bit better. But for small staff, being able to recognize cybersecurity attacks or notifications on their computer and address it properly, that's all part of your security awareness and training. And it's not just the overall security training of the organization, but specific training for specific personnel who have privileged access to applications, to data, may need some additional information. But I think training is a high impact control that you can put in place.
Great.
All right. Looks like there's one more. Are there any tables which show how much a control will reduce a risk? Looking for a percentage of threat reduced. That's a great question. I don't know, honestly, but I will note that, and I will get you a response to that.
All right, well, I will go ahead and close us out for today. Thank you, Ryan, for a great presentation. I also want to thank the audience for being engaged and submitting your questions to help guide today's conversation. If we didn't have time to answer your questions, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Also, feel free to reach out to our presenter if you have any additional questions. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts. We will also be sending the slides via email tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast. We'd like to share with you some resources found on our Moss Adams website. Please feel free to follow the links and see what we've provided for you. And finally, here is a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.